The boardroom doors of Hanul Tower swing open, cutting through the smug laughter of the board members. On one side sits the triumphant Mafia heiress Byung-ho, draped in black lace and diamond-encrusted dominance, finally ready to sign the papers that seal Minjun's debt to her family. Opposite her, in the seat reserved for the chairman, sits Gabriella. She is no longer in the cheap polyester uniform of a secretary. She is in a sharp ivory silk suit, radiating a quiet, terrifying authority. Between her and the billionaire who discarded her sits a 5-year-old boy, Minjun Jr., calmly coloring on the back of a billion-dollar merger contract. The scene creates an instant legacy math puzzle for Minjun and the gathered executives. The introduction shifts the stakes from financial ruin to a biological scandal. The visual of a vibrant, innocent child playing in the cold, glass and steel graveyard of Minjun's corporate empire creates immediate emotional tension. It forces the audience to calculate the 5-year gap since Gabriella's firing and realize that the boy isn't just a visitor. He is the rightful heir sitting in the center of a mafia-funded hostile takeover. The introduction leaves the audience desperate to know how a fired secretary became the majority shareholder, and how Minjun will react to the living evidence of his greatest mistake. The rain didn't just fall that afternoon in Seoul. It hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Hanul executive suite, like a rhythmic execution. Inside, the air was filtered, expensive, and suffocatingly still. Gabriella stood by the mahogany desk she had organized every morning for 3 years. She knew the scent of Minjun's preferred espresso, the exact pressure he liked on his touchscreens, and the way his brow furrowed right before he made a billion-dollar decision. She thought she knew his heart, too. But as she watched him stare at the gold-embossed wedding invitation resting on his desk, an invitation that did not bear her name, she realized she was standing in a room with a stranger. "The merger with the Joe Syndicate is finalized," Minjun said, his voice as cold as the glass behind him. He didn't look at her. He was looking at the city he was about to conquer. Byung-ho's father has signed the agreement. The marriage is the collateral. It's the only way to insulate Hanul from the coming recession. Gabriella felt a coldness spread from her fingertips to her chest. She reached into her blazer pocket, her fingers brushing the small, crumpled ultrasound photo she had intended to show him over dinner. A dinner he had canceled via a 2-word text. "And what about the collateral you've already taken from me, Minjun?" she asked, her voice trembling but clear. He finally turned. His eyes, once warm during late-night strategy sessions over takeout, were now shielded by the indifferent mask of a CEO. "Gabriella, let's not be dramatic. You've been an asset to this company. But a secretary, especially one with your background, doesn't fit the image of a man marrying into the most powerful family in the country. It's not just business. It's survival. I'm pregnant." The words fell like a heavy stone into a deep well. For a fraction of a second the mask slipped. Minjun's hand flinched, his gaze dropping instinctively to her waist. The silence stretched, filled only by the muffled roar of the storm outside. "How much?" he asked finally. Gabriella blinked, confused. "What?" "The settlement," Minjun said, stepping toward her. He pulled a checkbook from his inner pocket, a gesture so clinical it felt like a physical blow. "I'll provide enough for you to go back home. More than enough. You can live comfortably, start a small business, and take care of the situation. But you have to leave today. Not just the office. The country." "The situation?" Gabriella whispered, the ultrasound photo crinkling in her grip. "This is your son, Minjun. Not a line item on a balance sheet." "It's a complication," he corrected, scribbling a number on the check that would have made most people's heads spin. He tore it off and slid it across the desk. It sat there between them, a white slip of paper meant to erase a human life. Byung-ho is not a woman who tolerates complications. Her father is even less forgiving. "If they find out about this, I can't protect you. I won't even try." He walked to the window, dismissing her with his back. "Take the money, Gabriella. Disappear. It's the kindest thing I can do for you now." Gabriella looked at the check, then at the man she had loved, a man who had just traded his own blood for a mafia-backed throne. She didn't cry. The heat of her fury had dried her tears before they could fall. She didn't touch the check. Instead, she picked up the ultrasound and placed it on top of the money. "You think you're buying my silence," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous low hum. But you're actually buying my resolve. Keep your money, Minjun. You're going to need it to try and buy back your soul when I come to take everything else. She turned and walked out, her heels clicking a steady, defiant rhythm against the marble floors. As the elevator doors closed, she saw him finally pick up the ultrasound photo. He looked small against the backdrop of his empire. An hour later, Gabriella was standing on the sidewalk, the rain soaking through her clothes, her hand resting over her womb. She looked up at the glowing logo of Hanul Corporation one last time. She wasn't a secretary anymore. She was a mother with a 5-year plan. And the man at the top had no idea that he had just handed his greatest enemy, the only weapon that could truly destroy him. The rain continued to fall, washing away the girl who had been discarded, and leaving behind the woman who would return to own the room. The honeymoon phase of Minjun's marriage to Byung-ho had lasted exactly 3 hours, the time it took to finish the wedding reception, and for the last of the high-ranking government officials to leave the ballroom. As soon as the heavy oak doors of the Zhou family estate closed behind them, the mask of the doting bride shattered. Byung-ho didn't head for the master suite. She headed for the study, pouring herself a glass of neat whiskey while her father's men stood guard at the door like stone statues. The board seats will be transferred by Monday, she had told him, not looking up from her drink. And Minjun? Don't ever make the mistake of thinking this ring gives you authority over me. You are the face of Hanul. I am the spine. If the spine snaps, the face hits the dirt. 5 years later, Minjun stood on the balcony of their cold, minimalist penthouse, watching the neon pulse of Seoul and feeling the weight of that spine pressing against his throat. His marriage was not a union, it was an occupation. Every morning, he woke up in a bed that felt like a battlefield, and every evening, he returned to a home that was essentially a high-security prison. Byung-ho was as brilliant as she was ruthless. Under her influence, Hanul Corporation had grown, but it had grown dark. The clean tech company he had envisioned was now a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts, a sophisticated machine for laundering the Zhou family's blood money. He was the $10 billion figurehead, a golden bird in a cage made of mahogany and glass. The misery wasn't just in the lack of love, it was in the constant, low-thrumming presence of danger. He had learned to read the moods of the Zhou syndicate the way a sailor reads a coming storm. A dinner with his father-in-law wasn't a family gathering, it was an audit. One wrong word about the legitimacy of their operations, and a heavy hand would find its way to Minjun's shoulder, a silent reminder of how easily people in their world simply cease to exist. He often thought of the check he had slid across the desk to Gabriella. He wondered if she had cashed it. He hoped she had. In his darkest moments he envied her. She was out there somewhere free of the shadow of the Zhou family. He lived with the constant, gnawing guilt of what he had done, a ghost that haunted the corners of his opulent office. Every time he saw a child in a park or heard a soft laugh in a hallway, his mind did that treacherous, biological math again. 5 years. The child would be 5. Byung-ho entered the room, the scent of her expensive metallic perfume hitting him before her voice did. She was dressed for a gala, her neck draped in emeralds that looked like frozen droplets of poison. "You're brooding again," she said, her voice a sharp contrast to the soft memory of Gabriella's. "It's weak, Minjun. The hostile takeover bid from that European firm is gaining momentum. My father is losing his patience. If you can't hold the board, he will find someone who can." "I've handled the board for half a decade, Byung-ho," Minjun replied, his voice tired. "But this new investor, they're playing a game I don't recognize. They aren't looking for profit. They're looking for blood." Byung-ho stepped closer, her eyes cold and predatory. She straightened his tie, the gesture more like a noose tightening. "Then give them blood. Just make sure it isn't ours. Remember who you belong to, Minjun. You traded your soul for this empire. Don't let me find out you've started looking for it again." She left the room with a sharp click of her heels, leaving him in the silence. He looked at his reflection in the glass. He was a man who had everything, the title, the power, the heiress, and yet he was a man who owned nothing, not even his own name. He didn't know that across the city, in a hotel suite overlooking his tower, a woman was looking at the same skyline. He didn't know that the blood his wife spoke of was already at the gates. As he stood there, trapped in the hollow luxury of his Mafia marriage, The 5-year countdown was reaching its final seconds. The debt was coming due, and the woman who held the bill was someone he had spent 5 years trying to forget. In the grey, damp chill of London, far from the suffocating neon of Seoul, Gabriella lived as a ghost for the first 2 years. She occupied a cramped studio apartment in Shoreditch where the radiator hissed and the smell of rain seemed to permeate the very walls. To the world, she was just another immigrant mother pushing a stroller through the muddy grass of Victoria Park. But inside that apartment, late at night while little Minjun Jr. slept, the blue light of 3 monitors illuminated a woman who was systematically forging a suit of digital armor. She had refused to touch the check Minjun had given her. It sat in a glass jar on her kitchen counter, a yellowing slip of paper that served as her daily fuel. Every time her back ached from working a double shift at a local coding firm, or her eyes blurred from the lines of data she was analyzing, she looked at his signature. It was a reminder of the price he had placed on their son's life. She didn't want his money. She wanted his throne. Gabriella's assent was not loud. It was surgical. She understood the architecture of Hanul Corporation better than Minjun himself. She knew the vulnerabilities in their supply chains, the hidden fractures in their cloud infrastructure, and the exact ego-driven blind spots that Minjun's leadership created. Operating under the pseudonym Estrella, the goddess of justice, she began building a boutique tech investment firm that specialized in aggressive recovery. By the 3rd year, the studio apartment was gone, replaced by a sleek, glass-walled office in Canary Wharf. Gabriella had become a whisper in the ears of European venture capitalists. She was the woman who could predict a market crash before it happened and the engineer who had developed a proprietary encryption software that every logistics giant in Asia was desperate to acquire. She moved through the high-stakes world of London finance like a shadow, always obscured by shell companies and non-disclosure agreements. She was raising Minjun Jr. in a world of dualities. During the day, she was the mother who sang him songs in a mix of English and Korean, teaching him about the world with a tenderness she had once hoped to share with his father. But the moment he closed his eyes, she returned to the machine. She began buying up Hanul's secondary debt. She targeted the smaller shareholders who were terrified of the Zhou family's growing influence. She was a silent predator, circling a wounded beast that didn't even know it was bleeding. Her son was the living clock that dictated her pace. Every inch he grew, every new word he learned, increased the urgency of her mission. She watched him play with toy cranes and building blocks, his small hands moving with a precision that was hauntingly similar to the man who had discarded him. It was a daily reminder that the complication Minjun had tried to erase was now a thriving, brilliant human being, who deserved a legacy that wasn't built on Mafia secrets. The turning point came when Hanul Corporation attempted to expand into the European market. They needed a specific gateway patent to bypass local regulations, a patent held by a mysterious holding company called MJ Legacy. Minjun's legal team spent 6 months trying to find the owner, offering millions to an empty boardroom in London. Gabriella watched their desperate emails pile up in her inbox with a cold, detached satisfaction. She wasn't selling. She was waiting for the moment when Hanul's stock would dip low enough for her to strike. By the end of the 5th year, Gabriella stood in front of a floor-to-ceiling mirror in her London office, dressed in a suit that cost more than her first year's rent in Shoreditch. She looked at her reflection, a woman who had been fired in a rainstorm and reborn in a forge. She had successfully acquired 51% of Minjun's debt, and a controlling interest in his primary subsidiaries. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was the owner of the machine. She picked up her phone and dialed her lead counsel. "Prepare the private jet for Seoul," she said, her voice steady and devoid of the tremors that had once defined her. "And tell the board at Hanul to clear their schedules for Monday. The majority shareholder is coming home." As she hung up, Minjun Jr. ran into the room, clutching a drawing of a skyscraper. She picked him up, feeling the warmth of his small heart beating against hers. The math was finally complete. The girl who was meant to disappear was about to walk into the one room Minjun thought was his sanctuary, and she wasn't coming alone. The air in the Hanul Tower executive boardroom was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the metallic tang of desperation. Minjun sat at the head of the long obsidian table, his knuckles white as he gripped a stylus. Beside him, Byung-ho leaned back, her legs crossed, a predatory smile playing on her lips as she watched the board members bicker. They were vultures circling a dying beast, waiting for the final signature that would hand the company over to the Joe Syndicate's restructuring team. The vote is a formality, Minjun, Byung-ho whispered, her voice a sharp contrast to the low hum of the air conditioning. Sign the debt conversion. Save what's left of your pride. Minjun reached for the digital pad, but before the stylus could touch the glass, the heavy double doors at the far end of the room were thrown open with a force that made the crystal carafe on the table rattle. The room fell into a vacuum of silence. Gabriella walked in first. She moved with a rhythmic, predatory grace, her heels striking the floor like a countdown. She wore a suit of ivory silk that seemed to catch every light in the room, making her glow against the dark, somber wood of the executive suite. She didn't look like a secretary, she looked like a sovereign. But it was the person walking beside her that stopped Minjun's heart. A small boy, no more than 5 years old, held Gabriella's hand. He was dressed in a miniature charcoal blazer, his dark hair swept back exactly like Minjun's. He didn't look intimidated by the rows of scowling men in suits. He looked curious, his large, intelligent eyes scanning the room until they landed on Minjun. Minjun felt the world tilt. The biological math he had tried to suppress for 5 years surged to the forefront of his mind with the violence of a tidal wave. The timing, the rain, the ultrasound he had left on a desk alongside a blood money check. The boy wasn't just a child, he was a living mirror. What is the meaning of this? One of the elder board members barked, standing up. This is a closed session. Security. Gabriella didn't stop until she reached the opposite end of the table. She didn't call for security. She simply placed a slim, encrypted tablet on the table and slid it toward the center. Security won't be necessary, Director Kong, Gabriella said. Her voice was lower than it used to be, seasoned by years of command in the London fog. In fact, I'd suggest you sit down. You're speaking to the majority shareholder of Hanul's debt, and the owner of the MJ legacy patents you've been trying to buy for 6 months. Byung-ho's smile vanished, replaced by a mask of cold, mafia-bred fury. She stood up, her diamonds catching the light like jagged teeth. Gabriella? The little girl who used to fetch my husband's coffee? You've got a lot of nerve coming here with a child and a lie. Gabriella didn't even look at her. Her gaze remained locked on Minjun, who had gone ashen, his mouth slightly agape. I didn't come here to talk to you, Byung-ho, Gabriella said. She looked down at the boy and squeezed his hand. June, say hello to Mr. Park. The boy looked at Minjun, a small tentative smile forming. Hello, he said, his voice high and clear in the tomb-like room. The board members looked from the boy to Minjun, then back again. The resemblance was undeniable. The same slope of the nose, the same stubborn set of the jaw. The complication Minjun had tried to erase was now sitting at the head of his table. Minjun, Gabriella said, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried further than a shout. 5 years ago, you told me I didn't fit the image of your empire. You told me to disappear. So I did. I disappeared into the markets. I disappeared into the code. And while you were building a monument to your own success with someone else's blood money, I was building an empire that actually belonged to me. She tapped the tablet, and a holographic display bloomed above the table, showing a 51% ownership stake in Hanul's primary holding company. The gasps from the board members sounded like a collective intake of air before a drowning. I'm not here for a settlement, Minjun, Gabriella continued, her eyes flashing with a fire that had been stoking for half a decade. And I'm not here to ask for your permission. I'm here to tell you that the locks on this building have been changed. The accounts have been frozen. And your marriage contract with the Joe family? It's no longer worth the paper it's printed on because you no longer have a company to trade for it. Minjun finally found his voice, though it was cracked and fragile. Gabriella, the boy, is he? His name is Minjun, she replied, her posture unyielding. And unlike you, he knows exactly who he belongs to. Byung-ho let out a sharp, hysterical laugh. You think you can just walk in here and take what's ours? My father will have you wiped from the face of the earth before you reach the lobby. Gabriella finally turned her head to look at the heiress. Your father's assets are currently being audited by the International Monetary Task Force, based on data my firm provided this morning. I'd worry less about me, Byung-ho, and more about the federal agents currently waiting downstairs for your associates. The room erupted into chaos. Phones buzzing, directors shouting, Byung-ho screaming into her cell. But in the center of the storm, Minjun and Gabriella remained still. A decade of history and a 5-year-old secret standing between them. Gabriella leaned forward, her shadow falling over the liquidation papers Minjun had almost signed. I told you I'd come back for everything else, Minjun. This is just the first day. The fallout from the boardroom was not a quiet affair. It was a detonation that leveled the social hierarchy of Seoul overnight. Within hours, grainy footage of Gabriella walking into Hanul Tower with a child who possessed the park gaze had leaked to every major news outlet. The narrative that Minjun and Byung-ho had carefully curated, a story of power, stability, and the merging of two great dynasties, was being incinerated by a single undeniable image. Minjun sat in his private study at the Jo estate, the air thick with the smell of old tobacco and the looming threat of violence. Across from him, his father-in-law, Chairman Jo, sat in a throne-like leather chair, his face a mask of terrifying stillness. Byung-ho stood by the window, her silhouette sharp and jagged against the moonlight. A secretary, Minjun? The chairman's voice was a low, rasping growl. You brought a stray into our lineage? You allowed a complication to breathe for 5 years while taking my daughter's hand and my family's resources. I didn't know, Minjun said, though the words felt hollow even to him. I thought it was handled. Handled. Byung-ho spun around, her eyes flashing with a vitriol that transcended mere jealousy. She owns our debt, Minjun. She has frozen the accounts my father uses to maintain his agreements. This isn't just a scandal. It's a decapitation. And that boy is a walking death warrant for your credibility. The phone on the desk buzzed incessantly. Notifications from the Hanul legal team, news alerts and social media trending tags. Hashtag the secret heir, hashtag Hanul coup, hashtag Gabriella's revenge. The public was obsessed. The biological math that had stunned the boardroom was now being calculated by millions. The timing of Gabriella's firing matched the boy's age perfectly. The narrative of the billionaire and the heiress was being replaced by the story of the discarded mother and the ghost king. The chairman leaned forward, the light catching the scars on his knuckles. The DNA test. The public is demanding it. The board is demanding it to verify the legitimacy of the debt transfer. If that child is yours, Minjun, you have brought a foreign bloodline into a war that requires purity. You have made us look like fools. I'll take the test, Minjun said, his voice finding a strange, desperate steadiness. Part of him, the part that hadn't been buried by 5 years of mafia business, wanted to know. He wanted to see it in black and white. He wanted to know if the boy who had smiled at him in the boardroom truly carried his spark. The testing took place 48 hours later under the scrutiny of 3 independent labs and a court-appointed observer. Gabriella had agreed to it on one condition. The results would be read live to the board, with the press waiting outside. She wasn't hiding behind NDAs anymore. She was using the truth as a siege engine. When the results arrived, they weren't just a confirmation. They were a verdict. 99.99% probability of paternity. The digital document flashed on the giant screen in the Hanul lobby, visible to the swarming reporters outside. It was the final nail in the coffin of Minjun's reputation as a strategic leader. He wasn't a mastermind. He was a man who had abandoned his own son for a paycheck and a wedding ring. For the Jo family, the DNA result was an insult that required a blood response. To them, Minjun Jr. wasn't a grandson or an heir. He was biological evidence of a betrayal. In the high-stakes world of the Korean underworld, a mistake that public could not be forgiven. It threatened the syndicate's grip on the police, the politicians, and the markets. Minjun walked out of the testing facility to find his security detail had been replaced. The men standing by his car weren't Hanul employees. They were the chairman's personal enforcers. They didn't open the door with respect. They stood like jailers. The chairman wants to see you, the lead enforcer said, his hand resting significantly on the holster beneath his jacket. And he wants to discuss the disposal of the evidence. Minjun felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. For the first time in 5 years, he looked at the men who represented his wife's world and felt a sickening wave of revulsion. He realized then that Byung-ho wouldn't just sue Gabriella for the company. She would try to erase the boy from existence to clean the family tree. He pulled his phone from his pocket and sent a single, encrypted message to the one person he had spent half a decade trying to forget. They are coming for him. Hide. As the black sedan sped toward the Joe estate, Minjun watched the city lights blur. He had lost his company. He was losing his status. But as the DNA results continued to scroll across the news tickers on every skyscraper, he realized that for the first time in 5 years, he wasn't just a face for a mafia syndicate. He was a father. And a father's first job was to protect his son from the monsters he had invited to dinner. The digital confirmation of the DNA results was the final spark needed to ignite Byung-ho's cold, calculated rage. While Minjun sat paralyzed by the biological math, his wife was already weaponizing the machinery of her family's empire. She didn't scream or break the crystal vases in their penthouse. Instead, she sat at her vanity, applying a deep crimson lipstick as if preparing for war. By dawn, the narrative in the media shifted with terrifying precision. Byung-ho's public relations team, backed by the shadow resources of the Joe Syndicate, began a scorched earth smear campaign. They didn't target the child, they targeted the mother. Anonymous sources leaked falsified documents to the tabloids, painting Gabriella not as a wronged secretary, but as a corporate social climber who had strategically targeted the CEO and vanished only when her extortion plot failed. The Gold Digger's Gambit, one headline screamed. Another featured a doctored photo of Gabriella in London, suggesting she had been living a life of luxury funded by unnamed European benefactors, implying her rise in tech was nothing more than a front for money laundering. Byung-ho watched the news cycle from the Hanul Executive Lounge, her eyes fixed on the television screen. She knew that in the court of public opinion, a woman's character was the easiest thing to dismantle. If she could make Gabriella look like a villain, the child would be seen as a weapon of fraud rather than an heir of blood. Make sure the scholarship angle is pushed, Byung-ho instructed her assistant, her voice a low, jagged hum. I want the public to believe she used Hanul's proprietary secrets to buy her way into London's elite. I want her professional reputation so toxic that not even a startup in the slums will take her call. But the smear campaign was only the surface. Beneath the tabloid headlines, the Joe family enforcers were moving. Byung-ho had discovered the address of Gabriella's temporary residence, a high-security hotel owned by an international chain. It wasn't enough to ruin Gabriella's name. Byung-ho needed to erase the stain on her marriage. She placed a call to her father's lead enforcer. The boy is a liability to the merger, she said, her tone devoid of any maternal or human instinct. My husband is weak, and he is starting to look at that child with something like regret. I want that child removed from the board. Permanently. Do whatever is necessary to make it look like Gabriella's shady past caught up with her. As the morning sun hit the glass of Hanul Tower, Gabriella stood in her hotel suite, watching the television as her life was dissected and distorted by talking heads. She felt the weight of the heiress's fury pressing against the windows. She looked at Minjun Jr., who was happily playing with a set of wooden trains on the carpet, oblivious to the fact that his very existence had declared war on a mafia dynasty. Gabriella's phone chimed. It was the message from Minjun. They are coming for him. Hide. She didn't panic. She had spent 5 years preparing for this exact brand of malice. She walked to the window, watching a black sedan with tinted windows pull up to the hotel curb. She didn't see enforcers. She saw the desperation of a woman who had already lost. Pack your things, June, Gabriella said softly, her eyes never leaving the street below. We're moving to the second phase. The smear campaign was designed to isolate her, but Byung-ho had made one fatal mistake. She assumed Gabriella was still the girl who could be frightened by a headline. She didn't realize that while Byung-ho was fighting for her reputation, Gabriella was fighting for a legacy. And in that battle, the heiress's fury was nothing compared to a mother's resolve. The safe house was a minimalist loft in Mapogu, secured by the very private military contractors Gabriella had hired to protect her European interests. It was cold, clinical, and smelled of lemon polish and rain. A far cry from the corporate battleground of Hanul Tower. Minjun arrived alone, stripped of his Joe family security detail and his pride. He had spent 48 hours in a legal and emotional purgatory, watching his wife dismantle Gabriella's reputation on the news while his own soul felt like it was being hollowed out. Gabriella had agreed to a settlement negotiation, but when he entered the loft, there were no lawyers. There were no stacks of paper. There was only Gabriella, standing by a kitchen island, and a 5-year-old boy sitting on a rug, meticulously building a bridge out of magnetic tiles. "The lawyers are in the lobby," Gabriella said, her voice as sharp as a diamond. "But before we sign a single document that gives you any access to this boy's future, I need to know if there is anything left of the man I knew, or if you've completely turned into a statue for the Joe family." She picked up her blazer and her laptop. "I have a meeting with the creditors. You wanted a relationship with your son, Minjun. You wanted to prove the DNA results weren't just a liability. Here is your chance. 3 hours. No phone, no assistance, no complications. Just you and the child you told me to erase." Minjun froze as the door clicked shut behind her. The silence in the loft felt heavy, vibrating with the echoes of his own past mistakes. He looked at the boy, his son, and felt a terrifying sense of inadequacy. He could manage a workforce of 20,000, but he didn't know how to speak to a child who carried his own eyes. "Is that a bridge?" Minjun asked, his voice cracking. The boy looked up. There was no fear in his expression, only a quiet, analytical observation that made Minjun's heart ache. "It's a cantilever bridge," the boy replied, his Korean perfect but accented with a slight British lilt. "But the foundation is weak. It keeps falling." Minjun knelt on the rug, his expensive suit trousers creasing. He looked at the magnetic tiles. For the first time in 5 years, the math in his head wasn't about dividends or debt-to-equity ratios. It was about structural integrity. "You need to triangulate the base," Minjun whispered, his hands hovering over the toys. "If the center of gravity is too high, it won't hold the weight of the span." For the next hour, the billionaire CEO and the secret heir sat on the floor. Minjun found himself explaining physics to a 5-year-old, who listened with a hunger that mirrored his own. He watched the way the boy's fingers moved, precise, deliberate. He saw himself in the way the boy bit his lip when he was concentrating. As they worked, the boy spoke without looking up. "Mama said you were a builder. She said you built a tower so tall it touched the clouds." Minjun felt a lump form in his throat. "I built a lot of things, June. But I forgot to build the things that actually mattered." "Are you going to help us stay?" the boy asked, finally meeting his gaze. "The lady on the TV was saying mean things about Mama. She looked like the lady in the red dress from the picture on your desk." Minjun flinched. The lady in the red dress was his wife, the woman currently trying to destroy the boy's mother. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't just babysitting. He was witnessing the innocence he had almost allowed the Joe family to extinguish. The afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the room. Minjun found himself doing more than building bridges. He was making the boy laugh, chasing him around the sofa, and eventually, sitting on the floor as the child leaned against his shoulder, exhausted from the play. When the door opened and Gabriella returned, she stopped in the entryway. She saw the CEO of Hanul Corporation, a man who had once valued image above all else, sitting in the dark with a rumpled shirt and a sleeping child tucked against his side. The cantilever bridge stood tall on the rug, a perfect, stable structure. Minjun looked up at her, his eyes raw and red-rimmed. He didn't ask about the creditors. He didn't ask about the shares. "He likes the color blue," Minjun whispered, afraid to wake the boy. "And he's allergic to peanuts. You didn't tell me that in the boardroom." "I didn't think you'd care about the details, Minjun," Gabriella said, her voice softening for the first time in 5 years. "You were always a big-picture man." "The big picture is a lie, Gabriella," Minjun said, carefully shifting the boy into his arms to carry him to the bed. "I've spent 5 years building a monument to a man I don't even like. If this settlement is about the company, you can have it. If it's about him, I'll do whatever it takes. I'll burn the tower down myself if it means he's safe." Gabriella watched him, her hand gripping her bag. She had come back for revenge, but as she looked at the bridge on the floor, she realized that the biological math had finally produced a result she hadn't expected. A father who was starting to remember how to be a man. The morning after Minjun's meeting with his son, the digital landscape of Hanul Corporation began to dissolve. It started with a coordinated strike on the company's logistics servers, a surgical disruption that paralyzed the supply chains across 3 continents. This wasn't the work of an outside hacker. It was the work of someone with the master keys. Byung-ho had decided that if she couldn't own the throne, she would burn the kingdom to ash before Gabriella could sit on it. By noon, the financial markets were in a panic. Phony reports of massive data breaches and internal corruption were leaked to the press, sending Hanul stock into a vertical nosebleed. In the high-security executive suite, the screens that usually pulsed with green growth were now hemorrhaging red. Byung-ho stood in the center of the chaos, her phone pressed to her ear as she gave the final order to her father's financial liquidators. "Drain the offshore reserves," she commanded, her voice devoid of any tremor. "Transfer the intellectual property rights to the Zhou family holding companies. I want the Hanul name to be synonymous with bankruptcy by the time the closing bell rings." Minjun burst through the doors, his eyes bloodshot and his suit jacket missing. "What are you doing, Byung-ho? You're destroying the livelihood of 20,000 employees just to spite one woman." She turned to him, her expression one of cold, aristocratic boredom. "I'm not spiting a woman, Minjun. I'm reclaiming my dowry. You brought a bastard into our business. You allowed a common secretary to buy your debt. My father doesn't tolerate failures, and he certainly doesn't tolerate being made to look like a fool by a child." "It's my son," Minjun said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low register. "It's a liability," she spat back. "And now so are you. By tomorrow this building will be a hollow shell. Let Gabriella reign over a graveyard. Let her see what happens when you cross the Zhou syndicate." Minjun didn't argue. He realized that the woman he had married wasn't just ruthless. She was a scorched earth strategist who valued her ego over the very empire he had spent his life building. He turned on his heel and raced to the tech hub, but he found the doors locked. The security codes had been changed to the Zhou family's private protocols. In her hotel suite, Gabriella watched the tickers with a grim intensity. She saw the sabotage for what it was, a desperate, violent tantrum from a woman who had never been told no. Her lead analyst approached her, his face pale. "Ma'am, they're dumping the core assets. At this rate, the company will be insolvent within 48 hours. The hostile takeover won't matter if there's nothing left to take over." Gabriella looked at Minjun Jr., who was drawing on the floor, unaware that his future was being liquidated in real time. She realized that her revenge had a price she hadn't calculated. The destruction of the very legacy she wanted her son to inherit. She opened her private encrypted channel. "Minjun," she said when he picked up on the first ring. "She's dumping the patents. If they go to the Zhou family, we'll never get them back." "I can't get into the system, Gabriella," Minjun panted, his voice coming through the speakers of a crowded stairwell. "She's blocked my biometric access. I'm a stranger in my own building." "The Astrea protocols," Gabriella said, her fingers flying across her keyboard. "5 years ago, I left a backdoor in the cloud infrastructure. It was my insurance policy. I never thought I'd have to use it to save you." You left a backdoor?" "I was a secretary, Minjun. I saw how you discarded people. I had to protect myself." She hit a final key, and a map of the Hanul mainframe appeared on her screen, highlighted in a soft ethereal blue. "I'm uploading the countervirus now. It will freeze the transfers, but I need someone physically at the main server to bypass the manual Zhou family locks. If we don't stop the liquidation in the next 10 minutes, the company is dead." "I'm on the way," Minjun said. As he ran toward the basement levels, he heard the heavy boots of the Zhou enforcers in the hallway. This was no longer a corporate dispute, it was a physical war. Byung-ho had moved from sabotage to total annihilation. Minjun realized that saving his company was no longer about profit. It was about proving to Gabriella, and to the boy upstairs, that he was finally willing to fight for something other than himself. In the boardroom, Byung-ho watched her screens flicker and freeze. The Astrea logo, the scales of justice, bloomed across every monitor in the building. Her face contorted with a rage that was finally truly out of her control. "Find him," she whispered to her men. "And find her. If we can't have the company, no one leaves this building alive." The corporate sabotage had failed, but the blood debt had just begun. The digital freeze on Hanul Corporation's assets had lasted only minutes before the physical world turned violent. In the belly of the server room, Minjun watched the blue Astrea lights flicker as the building's backup generators hummed a low, ominous warning. He had stopped the liquidation, but the victory felt hollow. He knew the Zhou family. To them, a financial loss was a stain that could only be washed out with blood. He barely made it to the service elevator before the lobby was swarming with men in dark suits who didn't carry briefcases. They carried the heavy, silent authority of the Zhou syndicate. His phone buzzed, a frantic, high-definition video feed from Gabriella's hotel security. "They're through the first perimeter." Gabriella's voice crackled, breathless and sharp. "Minjun, they didn't come for the files. They're coming for June." "I'm 3 blocks away," Minjun shouted, sprinting through the rain-slicked alleyways behind the tower, his lungs burning. "The underground garage. Entrance B. Don't take the elevators." By the time they converged in the shadows of a concrete pillar, the world had shifted from a corporate drama to a survival thriller. Gabriella appeared out of the stairwell, her ivory suit smudged with dust, clutching Minjun Jr. to her chest. The boy's eyes were wide, but he remained silent, sensing the jagged edge of his mother's fear. Minjun didn't hesitate. He grabbed Gabriella's hand and pulled her toward an unmarked, reinforced SUV, the one vehicle the Zhou family hadn't tagged with a GPS tracker. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice tight as he slammed the door and threw the car into reverse just as a black sedan screeched into the garage. "The only place they can't go," Minjun said, his hands white on the steering wheel. "The demilitarized zone. I have a property near Payu. It's registered under a shell company Byung-ho never bothered to check. It's a fortress, Gabriella. We just have to get past the city limits." The drive was a blur of high-speed maneuvers and near misses. Behind them, the Zhou enforcers were a persistent shadow, weaving through the midnight traffic of Seoul. This was the blood debt Minjun had feared since the day he signed his wedding contract. He had traded his secretary for a throne, and now the queen was coming to collect his life. 2 hours later, the neon glow of the city faded into the oppressive darkness of the northern woods. They reached a secluded stone villa hidden behind a dense screen of pine trees and a sophisticated electronic gate. As the gates locked behind them, the silence of the forest felt like a heavy blanket. Inside, the villa was cold. Minjun lit a fire while Gabriella settled a shivering June onto a leather sofa, wrapping him in a wool blanket. The high-stakes adrenaline that had sustained them began to bleed away, leaving only the raw, uncomfortable reality of their situation. They were trapped together, the man who had discarded a life, the woman who had returned to destroy him, and the child who was the only reason they were both still breathing. "Why didn't you leave?" Gabriella asked, her voice echoing in the vaulted room. She stood by the fireplace, the orange light flickering across the hard lines of her face. "You could have stayed in the tower. You could have made a deal with the chairman. You could have survived." Minjun looked at his son, who had finally fallen into a fitful sleep. "I've been surviving for 5 years, Gabriella. It's a miserable way to live. When I saw him building that bridge, when I realized that he's the only thing I've ever been part of that wasn't built on a lie, I realized the tower wasn't worth the soul it cost me." He stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking for the first time since the rainstorm 5 years ago. "I'm not doing this for the company anymore. I don't care if Hanul burns to the ground. I just want him to have a father who isn't a coward." Gabriella looked at him, her eyes searching his for the deception she had come to expect. But all she saw was a man who had finally hit rock bottom, and realized the view was clearer from the floor. "The Zhou family won't stop," she whispered. "Byung-ho will see this as the ultimate betrayal. She'll use everything, the police, the syndicate, the press. We're ghosts now, Minjun." "Then let's be ghosts," he replied, his voice steady. "They can't kill what they can't find. We stay here, we rebuild the Astrea defense, and we wait for them to overreach. Byung-ho is impulsive when she's angry. She'll make a mistake." As the fire crackled, Minjun sat on the floor near the sofa, his back against the stone hearth. Gabriella sat on the other side of her son. For the first time in half a decade, they were under the same roof, not as boss and employee, or as enemies in a boardroom, but as parents in a bunker. The blood debt was still unpaid, and the monsters were still at the gate. But as Minjun watched the steady rise and fall of his son's chest, he knew he had finally made the right trade. The cold at the Payu Villa was different from the clinical chill of the Hanul executive suite. It was a raw, honest cold that bit through Minjun's expensive wool sweater, reminding him with every breath that he was no longer protected by the fortress of his status. Outside the reinforced windows, the wind howled through the DMZ pines, but inside, the only sound was the rhythmic scratching of a fountain pen. Minjun sat at the heavy oak dining table, a single lamp illuminating a stack of legal documents that had been delivered by a trusted, terrified courier under the cover of darkness. Gabriella stood by the window, her silhouette a sharp line of tension as she watched the perimeter cameras on her tablet. On the sofa nearby, Minjun Jr. was asleep, his small hand still clutching the magnetic tile bridge he and his father had built together. "You don't have to do this, Minjun," Gabriella said without turning around. "The Zhou family is already hunting us. Taking your money won't stop them from wanting your blood." Minjun didn't look up. He was reading through the clause that transferred his personal real estate, his offshore holdings, and his remaining 15% stake in Hanul, the last of his leverage, directly to an irrevocable trust managed by Gabriella. "It's not about stopping them," Minjun replied, his voice raspy from lack of sleep. "It's about making sure that if they get to me, they find a ghost. If I own nothing, I am no longer an asset to the Zhou syndicate. I become a liability they can't use to bargain with." He paused, his pen hovering over the final signature line. "Besides, this isn't my money. It's the profit made from 5 years of silence while you were struggling in the rain. It belongs to him." Gabriella finally turned, her eyes reflecting the amber glow of the fire. She saw the man who had once viewed her as a failed investment, now systematically erasing his own existence to provide a shield for their son. The irony was a bitter weight in the room. 5 years ago, he had offered her a check to make a problem disappear. Now he was handing her an empire to make a family survive. "By signing this, you lose everything," she warned, stepping closer to the table. "You won't have the board. You won't have the lawyers. You'll just be a man in a safe house with a target on his back." "I've had everything for 5 years, Gabriella, and I've never been more hollow," Minjun said. He looked at her, and for the first time the CEO mask was completely gone. In its place was a raw, desperate sincerity. "I've spent my life building monuments to myself. Let me build one thing that actually has a soul. Take the assets. Use them to buy the best security, the best lawyers, and a future for June that doesn't involve the Zhou family's shadow." He pressed the pen to the paper. The signature was bold and final. With that single stroke, the billionaire CEO of Hanul Corporation ceased to exist on paper. He was now legally and financially a ghost. He pushed the documents toward her. "It's done. The transfer is instantaneous through the Astria protocols. You are now the sole owner of every piece of my life." Gabriella looked at the papers, then at him. The revenge she had planned for 5 years, the total financial ruin of Minjun Park, was complete. She had won. She had taken his chair, his company, and now his very identity. But as she looked at him sitting in the dim light, stripped of his armor and looking at his sleeping son with a gaze of pure, agonizing love, the victory felt different than she had imagined. It didn't feel like a conquest, it felt like a sacrifice. "The chairman will find out within the hour," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "When he realizes you've moved the assets out of his reach, he'll stop playing corporate games. He'll send the wolves, Minjun." "Let them come," Minjun said, standing up. He walked over to the sofa and gently tucked the blanket around Jun's shoulders. "They can take my life, but they can't touch his future anymore. I've finally balanced the books, Gabriella." The silence that followed was broken by the sharp, electronic chirp of Gabriella's tablet. The perimeter sensors had been tripped. Multiple vehicles were approaching the gate, moving fast and without lights. The choice had been made, and the consequences had arrived. Minjun reached out, his hand hovering near Gabriella's for a second before he pulled back, mindful of the 5 years of hurt between them. "Get him to the basement. There's a reinforced tunnel that leads to the old ranger station. My driver is waiting there." "What about you?" she asked, a flash of genuine fear crossing her face. Minjun picked up a heavy iron fire poker, the only weapon he had left. He stood between the door and his family, a man who owned nothing but the ground he stood on. "I'm going to buy you 5 minutes," he said, his eyes fixed on the door. "Go. Now." As Gabriella gathered the sleeping boy into her arms and disappeared into the shadows of the hallway, she looked back one last time. Minjun was standing in the center of the room, framed by the firelight, finally looking like the man she had loved before the towers and the titles had corrupted him. He had made his choice, and for the first time in his life it was a choice that couldn't be bought. The headlights of the approaching SUVs cut through the dense DMZ mist like twin searchlights, illuminating the gravel drive in harsh, jagged flashes. Minjun stood behind the heavy oak door, his breath hitching in his chest. For 5 years, he had been a man of spreadsheets and soft leather chairs, a man who delegated conflict to lawyers and fixers. But as the first heavy boot kicked the door, sending a shudder through the frame, that version of Minjun Park died. "Go!" he roared over his shoulder, the command echoing through the vaulted hall. Gabriella didn't look back. She clutched June to her chest, her heart hammering against his small back as she ducked into the hidden panel behind the library bookshelf. The boy was eerily silent, his eyes wide, sensing the primal shift in the air. As the bookshelf clicked shut, plunging them into the cool, damp dark of the escape tunnel, the sounds of the villa became a muffled, violent symphony. Minjun didn't wait for the door to give way. He moved to the side, gripping the iron fire poker with a white-knuckled intensity. When the lock finally shattered and the door burst inward, 3 men in tactical gear surged into the foyer. They weren't there to serve papers. They moved with the professional lethality of the Joe Syndicate's cleanup crew. The first man didn't expect the CEO to be the one swinging. Minjun brought the iron poker down with a desperate, unrefined force, catching the enforcer across the shoulder. The man grunted, his handgun clattering to the floor. Minjun didn't think. He lunged, tackling the second man into a glass-fronted cabinet. Shards of crystal rained down like diamonds, slicing into Minjun's palms, but he felt nothing but the frantic need to buy seconds. "Where is the boy?" a voice rasped from the doorway. Minjun scrambled to his feet, blood dripping from his hands onto the Persian rug. He stood in the center of the room, his chest heaving, a jagged piece of glass held in his trembling hand. He looked at the third enforcer, a man he recognized as his father-in-law's personal shadow. "He's gone," Minjun panted, a dark, wild grin stretching across his face. "He's out of your reach. You've lost Joe." Outside, the extraction team Gabriella had hired, a group of silent, shadow-like professionals from her London network, hit the perimeter. Flashbangs erupted in the yard, white light searing through the windows. The chaos provided the distraction Minjun needed. He dived over the sofa as the enforcer leveled his suppressed weapon. In the tunnel, Gabriella reached the ranger station, her lungs burning from the thin, cold air. A black armored sedan sat idling in the tall grass, its lights off. Her lead security officer held the door open. "Get in, ma'am. We have to move now," he urged. "Wait," Gabriella gasped, looking back at the dark silhouette of the villa. "Minjun is still inside." "Our orders were to extract you and the asset," the guard replied, his hand on his holster. "The villa is compromised." "He isn't an asset," Gabriella snapped, her voice breaking the silence of the woods. "He's the father of my son. We don't leave without him." Back at the house, the air was thick with smoke and the smell of ozone. Minjun was pinned against the wall, the enforcer's hand around his throat. "The chairman doesn't like loose ends," the man hissed. But Minjun wasn't looking at the gun. He was looking at the small magnetic bridge on the floor, the one he and June had built. It was crushed under a heavy boot. That sight triggered something deeper than fear. With a guttural roar, Minjun drove his elbow into the man's ribs and twisted, using his weight to send them both crashing through the floor-to-ceiling window. They hit the terrace in a tangle of limbs and broken glass. Before the enforcer could recover, a spotlight from the forest edge blinded them. "Drop the weapon," a voice commanded. Gabriella's extraction team moved in with surgical precision, neutralizing the remaining Joe enforcers in seconds. Gabriella herself ran across the lawn, ignoring the shouts of her guards. She reached Minjun as he was struggling to sit up, his expensive sweater shredded, his face a mask of blood and grit. She knelt beside him, her hands hovering over his wounds. "You idiot," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. "You almost got yourself killed." Minjun looked up at her, coughing out a breath of cold night air. He looked at the car where Jun's small face was visible against the glass. Did they get away? We're all getting away, Gabriella said. She helped him stand, his weight leaning heavily against her. As they were hurried into the sedan, Minjun looked back at the burning villa. The life he had built, the towers, the Mafia marriage, the $10 billion empire, was literally going up in flames. He was bleeding, he was bankrupt, and he was a fugitive. But as he slid into the back seat and felt Jun's small, warm hand slip into his, he realized he had never felt more like a man. He wasn't a suit anymore. He was a shield. The car tore away into the darkness of the DMZ, leaving the Zhou family's vengeance behind in the ash. They weren't safe yet, but for the first time in 5 years they were together. 5 years after the fires at the Payu Villa, the morning sun climbed the side of a glass tower that no longer bore the name of a dynasty. The Hanul logo had been stripped away, replaced by a minimalist emblem of a rising sun and a child's handprint. The company was now simply Legacy Tech, a corporation rebuilt not on the shifting sands of Mafia debt, but on the solid foundation of the patents Gabriella had protected in the London fog. Inside the familiar boardroom, the air felt different. The clinical, suffocating tension of the past had evaporated, replaced by a quiet, industrious hum. Gabriella stood by the window, a cup of tea in her hand, watching the city. She no longer wore the ivory suit of a vengeful queen. She wore a soft, charcoal-colored cashmere sweater, her expression one of hard-won serenity. She had dismantled the Zhou syndicate through a series of legal masterstrokes, using the evidence Minjun provided to ensure Byung-ho and her father were relegated to the history books of criminal trials. The door opened, but there was no dramatic flourish. Minjun walked in, carrying a stack of files and a plastic lunchbox decorated with space shuttles. He looked younger, the sharp, anxious lines of his face softened by time and a lack of expensive expectations. He didn't sit at the head of the table. He sat in a cubicle near the development team, where he had been working as a senior architect for the past 2 years. He had started from the bottom, refusing any executive title. He wanted to earn his place in the company the same way he wanted to earn his place in his son's life, through work, not birthright. The structural integrity reports for the Busan project are finished, Minjun said, looking up as Gabriella approached. And I checked the cafeteria menu. It's peanut-free today. Gabriella smiled, a genuine warm curve of her lips that once would have felt impossible. You're getting better at the details, Minjun. I have a good teacher, he replied, nodding toward the glass-walled play area at the end of the hall. Through the glass, 6-year-old Jun was showing a group of interns how to stabilize a model bridge. He moved with a confidence that wasn't born of arrogance, but of security. He knew who he was. He knew he was loved. And he knew that the man working at the desk nearby was more than a name on a birth certificate. He was the person who stayed up late to help with math homework and the one who had stood between him and the dark. Minjun stood up, stretching his back. I'm taking him to the park after his lessons. We're working on a real bridge model, wood and stone this time. Would you like to join us? Just for an hour. Gabriella looked at the man who had once discarded her in the rain. He had given up $10 billion, a presidency, and a life of luxury to be the man who made his son's lunch. He hadn't asked for a settlement or a second chance at a marriage. He had simply shown up day after day, until the silence between them wasn't a weapon anymore, but a bridge. I think I'd like that, she said softly. As they walked toward the elevator together, the staff didn't bow or scramble in fear. They offered polite nods to the CEO and her most dedicated architect. The new empire wasn't about the height of the tower or the weight of the bank account. It was about the fact that Gabriella could finally sleep without a hand on her son's shoulder, and Minjun could finally look in the mirror without seeing a stranger. The elevator doors closed, reflecting a family that had been broken, scattered, and rebuilt into something far stronger than the original. The 5-year plan was over. The revenge was gone. All that remained was the quiet, peaceful hum of a legacy that finally truly belonged to them. Gabriella reached out, her fingers brushing Minjun's hand as the elevator descended. She had finally found her peace, not by destroying the man who hurt her, but by watching him become the man her son deserved.